The day Hollywood received the news that Rob Reiner had passed away, the entire film industry seemed to slow by a single beat. A man who had stood behind some of the warmest stories ever told on the American screen left quietly, leaving behind a void that was difficult to name, let alone fill. The funeral was held privately in a small chapel in Brentwood. There were no cameras and no carefully prepared speeches in light flowers, in candlelight, and those who had truly stepped into Rob's life. When everyone thought the ceremony would end in silence, Billy Crystal slowly rose to his feet. He did not step to the podium right away. He stood for a long time, head bowed, as if asking himself whether he truly had the courage to continue. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse and low, breaking mid-sentence. He said that he was the person Rob had chosen to confide in during his final days and that he had not fully understood how desperate Rob truly was. The room froze. What Billy was about to share was not a farewell, but a belated confession about pain carried in silence. Warning signs overlooked, and a friendship now forced to live on with a regret that would never fade. As news of Rob's passing continued to spread, headlines piled up and his name, once woven into the memories of an entire generation, was spoken again. This time in a lower, heavier tone. People stopped talking about movies and began asking a single question in private calls and closed-door conversations: why him? In contrast to the noise outside, Rob's farewell unfolded in silence. Die. The small space was sealed off from the clamorous world beyond. A yellow candlelight washed over dark, wooden walls. White flowers lined the aisle, their scent light but lingering. The pews were set close together, everyone seated still, eyes forward. There were no whispers, only careful footsteps and deliberately held breaths. There was nothing left to conceal, only a small room and the absence Rob had left behind, quiet yet unbearably heavy. The door at the back opened slowly. Billy Crystal stepped inside without looking around, his gaze fixed ahead as if even a glance to the side might cost him his composure. In his hands was a simple bouquet of white flowers, neatly tied with a small, wrinkled card tucked among the stem's edges marked by hesitation. His steps were slow and weighted. When he stopped before Rob's portrait, he stood there for a long time, caught between stepping forward and retreating, acceptance and denial. He placed the flowers, adjusted the card, then walked to the front and took the microphone, carrying no notes. I hate having to do this, he said softly, because if I'm standing here, it means Rob is really gone. He spoke without strain, without theatricality, yet the room felt utterly still. Billy said Rob had never been loud. He never entered a room to command attention. He was simply present enough to make others feel safe. Now, Rob had small habits that never changed. He called at exactly the right time, never early, never late. After every appearance Billy made, Rob would send a brief message, just enough to say he had watched. And before anything else, Rob always asked one question: "Are you okay?" Billy lowered his head as he explained that it was never a routine question. Rob waited for the answer. If Billy stayed silent, Rob stayed with him. If Billy said he wasn't okay, Rob did not rush to fix it. He stayed. He sat beside him until Billy could breathe again in his own way. In a life full of people trying to erase sadness, Rob never tried to erase it. He respected it. Billy turned slightly toward the family and spoke of how Rob never stood alone. Behind him, there was always his wife, Michelle Singer Reiner, place where laughter came to rest. Then Billy's voice dropped. He spoke of a final message from Rob he had meant to answer later, of a meal they had planned for next week, of a simple sentence he had postponed. "I thought we still had time?" He said, "I let later steal the last time." After a long silence, Billy shared the part he had avoided. Rob, he said, hated burdening others. Yet on late nights, Rob would call not to vent, sometimes not even to speak, ask strange questions about fatherhood, about watching a child, change and not knowing how to hold on. That was when he spoke of his son, Nick Reiner, and a long struggle with addiction. Rehabilitation attempts came and went, but Rob never allowed himself to believe any attempt was the last. Rob worried not with anger, but with helplessness. He feared phone calls that might come at any moment. He feared saying too much or staying silent too long. He feared that love might not be enough. He even spoke of money and inheritance, not out of greed, but out of concern that leaving too much too soon might push his son deeper into harm. "I love him," Rob once said, "but I'm afraid what I leave behind could make him fall faster." Only once did Rob voice a darker fear that addiction might one day strip his son of reason, to the point where he might not recognize who stood in front of him. Rob did not dwell on it. He carried it alone. He never turned it into accusation or distance. He stayed, kept calling. He kept believing that presence still mattered. Standing there, Billy said Rob no longer appeared as a director or icon, but as a father carrying a deeply human worry, one familiar to anyone who has ever loved a child they could not fully protect. If people remembered Rob, Billy hoped they would remember that first. A father who tried, who stayed, who never turned away. To understand why Billy collapsed under the weight of a few sentences, he had to go back to the beginning. Rob was not just a name in film history to him. He was the person who witnessed an entire lifetime from early struggles to hard-earned clarity. They met before either was an icon, sharing a rhythm of comedy rooted in observation and kindness. They could argue for minutes over a single word, a pause, a silence, and end in laughter. That understanding found its clearest form in their work on When Harry Met Sally. Rob shaped the rhythm behind the camera. Billy carried it to the audience. The film lived an ordinary dialogue that touched what people were afraid to say about love, loneliness, and time. For the world, it was romance. For them, it was proof of understanding. They did not need constant contact. One call was enough. Rob always showed up not to fix things, but to ask one simple question and share the silence. In a place where relationships are often calculated, theirs was not. It endured without noise, built on kindness, presence, and the quiet courage to stay. In the years that followed that defining chapter of their lives, time did what time always does. It created distance without breaking connection. Careers expanded, schedules tightened, and the public image of both men slowly drifted away from the quiet bond that had once been forged in rehearsal rooms and late-night conversations. From the outside, it appeared as though their lives had moved in parallel lines rather than side by side. But beneath that surface, the rhythm they had learned to share never truly disappeared. Billy often said that. Rob had an unusual way of staying present without intruding. He didn't demand updates. He didn't check in for the sake of reassurance. He waited, and when he called, it was never accidental. It was always at the exact moment Billy needed to hear a familiar voice that didn't ask him to perform, explain, or defend himself. That consistency, that quiet reliability became something Billy depended on more than he ever admitted out loud. As the years passed, Rob's life filled with new responsibilities, new projects, and new roles that the public rarely noticed. Became a mentor without announcing it, a listener without labeling himself as one. Younger filmmakers sought his advice, often expecting technical guidance, only to leave with something entirely different, a sense that storytelling was less about control and more about empathy. Rob never framed it as wisdom. Oh, he spoke as someone still learning, still uncertain, still deeply aware of how fragile people could be beneath their confidence. Billy watched this from a distance, proud but never surprised. To him, this was simply who Rob had always been, someone who understood that the power of a story did not come from volume or spectacle, but from honesty. Someone who believed that audiences did not need to be impressed as much as they needed to be understood. That belief shaped everything Rob touched, even when the industry around him moved toward louder, faster, and more marketable forms of expression. Behind closed doors, however, the weight Rob carried grew heavier. Billy would later admit that there were moments he sensed something was changing, something settling deeper into Rob's voice. Not despair, not bitterness, but a tiredness that did not lift with rest. When Rob spoke about his family, his tone softened even further, as if each word needed to be handled carefully. As though speaking too loudly might disturb something already fragile, Rob never dramatized his fears. He spoke of them in fragments, incomplete thoughts, questions without conclusions. He worried about making the wrong choice, about misreading silence, about the fine line between protection and control. Billy listened, believing perhaps too easily that listening itself was enough. He believed that as long as Rob was speaking, as long as he was reaching out, there would always be another conversation, another chance to say the things that mattered most. That belief is what haunted Billy the most. At the funeral, as he stood before that room filled with candlelight and restrained grief, Billy realized how often he had trusted time to do the work courage should have done. It postponed difficult conversations, assuming the space between them was stable, assuming their bond was immune to interruption. He had believed that friendships built over decades could withstand silence without consequence. But standing there, he understood that silence, too, has a cost. The people seated in that chapel did not hear a celebrity speaking about another celebrity. They heard a man confronting the limits of loyalty, the boundaries of love, and the quiet arrogance of believing there would always be a tomorrow. Billy did not frame it as a lesson, Now, he did not tell anyone what they should do differently. He simply let the truth exist in the room, heavy and unresolved. After Billy stepped away from the microphone, no one rushed to fill the space he left behind. The ceremony did not continue immediately. There was no music to soften the moment. No guiding voice to redirect attention. People remained still, some staring at the floor, others at the framed photograph at the front of the room. A few wiped their eyes, but most did not move at all. It was as if motion itself felt inappropriate, as though moving too quickly might disrespect the honesty that had just been shared. Outside the chapel, the world continued as it always does. Cars passed, phones vibrated with messages. Somewhere nearby, a television played a familiar scene from a familiar film. But inside that small room, time felt suspended, caught between memory and regret, in the days that followed. Stories about Rob began to circulate, anecdotes from film sets, quotes from interviews, clips replayed across screens. People revisited his work, rediscovered lines of dialogue that felt newly weighted, newly personal. Scenes that once seemed light now carried an undercurrent of restraint and care. As though Rob had always been quietly revealing himself through his characters without ever saying his own name. Billy noticed something else too. People began reaching out, not to him, but to one another. Friends called after long silences. Family members asked questions they had been avoiding. There was no public acknowledgement that Rob's story had prompted this shift, but Billy recognized it immediately. Rob had always believed that presence mattered more than instruction. Even in absence, that belief continued to ripple outward. Privately, Billy struggled with his own reckoning. Grief did not arrive as a single emotion. It came in waves. Layered over affection, sadness, tangled with gratitude. He replayed conversations in his mind, hearing Rob's voice ask questions that now sounded like invitations he had not fully accepted. He wondered how many moments he had mistaken for ordinary simply because they were gentle. One evening, weeks after the funeral, Billy found the last message Rob had sent him. It was short as always, no explanation, no urgency. Just a familiar presence reaching out. Billy stared at the screen for a long time before setting the phone down. For the first time, there was no possibility of reply. And yet, in that stillness, Billy felt something shift, not closure, but clarity. Rob had not needed grand gestures. He had needed to be met where he stood. That realization did not erase the regret, but it gave it shape. We reminded Billy that love is not measured by intensity, but by attention. By the willingness to stay, even when staying feels uncomfortable, even when it offers no solution. In the months that followed, Billy began speaking differently about Rob, not more often, but more carefully. He resisted turning Rob into a symbol or a warning. He spoke of him as he had known him, a man who listened, who worried, who stayed. A man who understood that being present did not mean having answers, only having the courage to remain. Rob Reiner's legacy would always be written in films, in characters who spoke plainly about complicated emotions. In stories that trusted the audience to feel rather than be told what to feel. But for those who knew him, his true legacy lived elsewhere, in the unanswered questions he was brave enough to ask, in the silences he respected, and in the love he offered without conditions, even when it frightened him. And perhaps that is why the room at his funeral felt so heavy, so complete in its stillness. Because for once there was nothing left to say, only the understanding that some people shape our lives not through dramatic acts, but through quiet constancy. Through showing up, through asking again and again, the simplest question of a land waiting patiently for the answer. Long after the public attention softened and the headlines moved on, the absence Rob left behind continued to work its way quietly through the lives of those who had known him well. Did not announce itself. It appeared in small, ordinary moments, the pause before answering a phone call, the instinct to reach for advice that was no longer there, the habit of waiting for a message that would never arrive. Grief in that sense did not feel dramatic. It felt procedural, woven into routine, revealing itself only when something familiar failed to happen. For Billy, mornings became the hardest, not because they were filled with sadness, but because they were empty of expectation. For years there had been an unspoken certainty that Rob was somewhere in the world, awake or asleep, reachable if needed. That certainty had shaped how Billy moved through his own life, how he carried his doubts without panic. When that certainty disappeared, it left behind not panic, but a new vulnerability, one Billy had to learn to sit with on his own. He began to understand something Rob had practiced instinctively. That strength did not come from pushing discomfort away, but from letting it exist without immediately naming it a problem. Rob had lived that way. He had allowed fear to be present without letting it dictate his actions. He had allowed uncertainty to coexist with love. That balance was something Billy now recognized as rare and harder to maintain than it ever appeared from the outside. As Billy revisited their shared history in quiet moments, he realized how much of Rob's influence had shaped him beyond the screen. Rob had taught him how to listen without preparing a response, how to let silence do part of the work, how to understand that some questions were not meant to be answered, only held. These lessons had never been formal. They had emerged through years of proximity. Through watching how Rob handled discomfort without trying to dominate it, there were times Billy wondered whether Rob knew the depth of his impact, whether Rob ever understood that his restraint, his refusal to oversimplify pain, had offered others permission to do the same. Billy suspected Rob might have brushed it aside if asked. He would have redirected the conversation, asked how Billy was doing instead. That, too, felt painfully consistent. In the wider industry, Rob's absence created a subtler shift. Meetings felt louder. Decisions felt sharper. There were fewer pauses, fewer moments where someone stopped to ask whether a scene felt true rather than impressive. It was not that Rob had been the only person capable of such restraint, but he had modeled it so consistently that others had followed without realizing why. When that quiet leadership vanished, the space it left behind became noticeable. Some tried to fill it. Others did not even realize it was missing. Billy noticed both reactions and understood that neither was wrong. Grief, he had learned, was not a shared rhythm. It moved differently through each person, revealing itself only when it was ready. One particularly quiet night, Billy found himself thinking not about the last conversation with Rob, but about the first. He remembered the ease of it, the absence of performance, the sense that he did not need to be sharper or funnier to earn Rob's attention. That memory carried with it an unexpected comfort. It reminded him that the bond they shared had never depended on proximity or productivity. It had depended on recognition. That recognition, Billy realized, was what Rob had offered his son as well, not solutions, not ultimatums, but presence. Even when fear crept in, even when exhaustion set its weight into Rob's voice, he had remained. Billy understood now that Rob's greatest struggle had not been helplessness itself, but the fear of withdrawing because of it. Rob had chosen to stay anyway. That choice, more than any achievement, defined him. As time continued forward, Billy began to carry Rob differently. Not as a loss that demanded constant mourning, but as a standard or reminder of how to be with others when certainty is impossible. He began asking the question Rob had asked him so often, and asking it without rushing past the answer. He learned to wait, to listen, to let silence remain unbroken when words would only dilute what was already understood. Rob Reiner's story would never be fully captured by public memory or professional legacy. It lived instead in these private recalibrations, in the way people learned to stay with one another a little longer, to hesitate before offering answers, to choose presence over performance. That was the inheritance Rob left behind, not something that could be written into a will, but something that passed quietly from one person to another, only noticeable when it was practiced. And perhaps that is why, even now, Rob's absence does not feel like a conclusion. It feels like a pause, one that asks something of those left behind. Not resolution, not certainty. Just the courage to remain, to listen, and to believe that staying, even when it offers no guarantees, sometimes the most powerful act of love there is. And so the story comes to rest not with applause, not with answers, and not with closure. It ends the way Rob lived, quietly, deliberately, without asking to be understood. What remains is not a mystery to solve, but a presence to honor, a man who stayed when staying was hard, a friend who listened without fixing, a father who loved without turning away, even when love carried fear with it. Those who knew him will carry that lesson forward in ways no one else will ever fully see. In pauses held a little longer, in questions asked without urgency, in silence shared without discomfort. Rob Reiner did not leave behind instructions for how to grieve him. He left behind an example of how to be with one another while time is still kind enough to allow it, and perhaps that is the truest ending there can be, not goodbye, but remembrance shaped into presence. Not loss alone, but a quiet reminder that later is never guaranteed, and that showing up gently and fully is sometimes the most enduring legacy of all.